Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a really exciting class about greywater with Alan Hackler. He's the owner of Bay Maples Landscape, and he's very knowledgeable in water conservation and California wild landscapes and native plants. Everyone, I think, should be muted. Feel free to submit your questions via chat, and we'll try to address them at the end of the presentation. And the class is being recorded, so I'll go ahead and email a link to the presentation, and I'll share the PDF copy of the presentation that you're seeing today as well. So let's welcome Alan. Alan, thank you for being here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for everyone attending through Zoom. This is actually my first Zoom presentation, so we've worked at all the kinks and go well. If there's any hiccups, please bear with us. So I own and operate Bay Maples Wild California Gardens. We're based out of San Jose, California. I'm a licensed contractor and certified greywater installer for 10 years. We do garden design and installation, incorporating greywater, rainwater, native and drought tolerant plants, and recycled and sustainable materials whenever possible. And that is sort of the scope and the philosophy of what my company does. And I'm just going to go ahead and just jump right into it. And I'm going to open up the PowerPoint, get into full screen mode. And if anyone has any questions, you can send your questions in through the chat box, and you'll read through them at the very end. So, okay. So we're gonna, I'm gonna try and cover as much as I can about greywater and various topics. I'm not gonna be able to get into super detail on every single element, but I will go into as much detail as possible as we can fit into the time frame allotted. So, get my PowerPoint's just loading up here in seconds. Just give me one moment here. My computer's like a car starting in the wintertime. You got to give it a little time to rev up here a little bit.
Well, folks are still coming in, so we've got a couple minutes in.
Okay, great. Okay, there we go, finally. Okay. So, I'll give a couple people to trickle in. But my presentation, we're going to cover different types of greywater systems. We're going to go over some of the different greywater code, different soaps that are allowed for greywater, some of the different plumbing and irrigation techniques and products. I've got a couple of visual aids here that I'll show through my camera so people can get a sense of it. I will also talk about different manufacturers of different parts, where you can find certain parts, how to implement them as well. So there'll be some of the various highlights. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump into our slideshow, which is still going kind of slow. Come on, work with me, please. So what this first slide should say is, and hopefully it'll pop up here in a second, but just what is greywater? So greywater oftentimes gets used interchangeably with greywater and rainwater, black water, reclaimed water. But greywater specifically is used household water from your laundry machine, your shower, bathtub, and bathroom sink. So more or less everything in the house except toilets and kitchen sinks. In some areas of the country, they do permit kitchen sink greywater use, but currently in California, we consider kitchen water is classified as black water, mainly because of food scraps and grease that are found in the water. Grease and food scraps can offer some additional challenges because the grease can clog up some of the plumbing lines, and the food can also attract critters if not handled correctly. So because of that, California dictates that kitchen water is black water and must be sent right to the sewer. And my screen is still struggling, which is a little frustrating. And how that differs from reclaimed water, which is purple pipe water, which you see sometimes you'll see it more common in used by the city or in parks or large businesses. And that's what they call the purple pipe water. So if you ever see that kind of purple pinkish colored pipes, or if you say, it'll say little things that reclaim water, that's water that's gone to the sewer treatment plant, has been treated to near potable levels, and is then used in landscape use. So it's similar to gray water, but that is actually treated versus gray water is untreated. And then rainwater is water collected from a gutter, typically from a roof, and stored into a tank. And that can also be used for irrigation and for potable water if there's a potable drinking filtration system connected to it. And so those are some of the various differences in different types of water, but they're often used interchangeably. And even though it sounds insignificant, they all have quite different uses and levels of purity. So it is pretty important to differentiate the two. I'm going to just go back out and then see if I might have to stay in this view, I think, just because it's.
Alan,
Should I just stay in this view?
I can also share my desktop screen as well, if you'd like. But if this doesn't work out, but we can see your slides now.
Okay, I'm just going to stay in this view because I think the other one was having trouble. So it's a little bit zoomed out, but I think it's better than not seeing anything.
Sure.
Yeah, so this was what I was just mentioning a few moments ago, the difference between gray water and black water. And then, even though the slide doesn't include it, rainwater and reclaimed water are also other types of water that often get interchanged and used, sometimes used incorrectly. So I just wanted to clarify some of those differences. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. So California Greywater Code, all the current standards for gray water use right now were implemented back in 2009, and that happened during a modification to the California Plumbing Code, Chapter 16A. And when they modified the plumbing code, they basically made the permitting process more simplified for gray water. Gray water has actually always been legal in California, but the process to getting a system permitted and allowed for residential use was very cumbersome, time-consuming, and very costly. It required an architect, soil engineer, city approval, blueprints. And because of that, most people either just circumvented the law and just did their own kind of DIY style systems, or they did it correctly, but just wasn't permitted. So there's no way for the state to really know how many systems were out there, were they being used correctly, were they using incorrectly, what amount of water is being saved with gray water systems. So basically as a way to kind of bring it to a point where they had a better understanding of how many systems are out there and encouraging people to do it correctly, they made changes to the gray water code. And that new code that was adopted is still the code that we are using today. And they basically break gray water use up into two types. You have simple systems and complex systems. Simple systems, basically laundry systems, don't require a permit. As you see in later slides that I'm going to show, the only change for the laundry system is basically the outlet behind the machine. So there's no change to the actual plumbing under the house or under a crawl space. And because there's no actual change to the plumbing, there is no plumbing permit needed. Whereas bathroom systems, you do modify the plumbing system and the sewer connection, and that is why permits are required for bathroom systems. And they can be a little bit more expensive, do require a permit and some design work to be completed, but not nearly as complex and troublesome as it was previously. So I try not to let that be too much of a hurdle for people to implement these systems. And even though I do recommend, if you're going to do a bathroom system to work with a designer, plumber, or contractor, it's not absolutely required. A homeowner can go through the process themselves, but it can be, if you're new to it, can seem a little daunting. So I do recommend having someone, a professional, be involved in that process. And so some of the, I won't go into all of the Greywater code, but some of the important elements are, so when they changed the law, one of the sticking points was they want to make sure that Greywater is not exposed to people. So people can't touch it, put it in their mouth, interact with potable water. So all the different code requirements are based on that underlying caveat, is how do we make sure that people don't touch it and get sick from it. So in order to limit human contact, all Greywater needs to be plumbed underground, outletted under a mulch, 2 inches of mulch through a mulch basin, which you'll see in some later slides. And even though that the laundry systems don't require a permit, you still must adhere to these basic code requirements. Another important element is having a throughway valve, which I'm just going to hold up here in my hand. So what the throughway valve does is it allows you to switch the flow of the Greywater leaving the house. So it can either flow from the inside into the landscape or back to its original destination into the sewer line. And why you use a three-way valve versus a two-way valve is a three-way valve can never be turned in an off position. So it's always going to go either to the sewer or the landscape. Oftentimes when I get called out to systems and they've either kind of done a DIY setup or they've had someone who's not that familiar with these types of systems, they put in two-way valves. And the difficulty with using a two-way valve, it can be done with multiple two-way valves, but if they're using one single two-way valve, you have a scenario where you could turn the system completely off. And what will happen is if that pipe closes, so there's no way for the Greywater to go anywhere, you can either have a broken pump from the laundry machine or a backed up pipe. So the beauty of a throughway valve is you can never turn the flow of the water off completely. You're just changing the location of where it outlets, either to sewer or irrigation. So if you're gonna try,
sorry, could you hold it up so we could see that again?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
So no problem.
Yeah.
So here's the three-way valve. So, and you'll see in some of the slides too. So you have depending on how it's configured, you can either have the top or the side be the inlet, and the other two side will be the two outlets. And you could turn this handle, and that will dictate which direction the flow of the water will go. And I'll show you in a couple of slides of where you actually will position this. And so one of the reasons why when DIY homeowners don't use a three-way valve is because these are typically not found at a retail store. So what people will do is they will see maybe my presentation, or they'll see something online, or through a friend or through a book, and it'll say, oh, must have a three-way valve. Then they'll go down to the hardware store, and everyone that asks about three-way valve just gives them kind of a funny look because they've never heard or seen of one, because usually it's not a very typical plumbing connection. And the plumber would say, oh, well, we don't have a three-way valve, but just use a ball valve. And the homeowner would be like, oh, it looks very similar. Why not just grab that and use that? But it's just, it sounds like a simple change. It won't have an impact, but it will have a dramatic change to how the system functions. It just basically won't function correctly. You're setting yourself up for a possible clog, breaking of your laundry system pump. So it's really, really critical to make sure you're using a three-way valve. And I'll show you later on too. And so some of the other kind of important parts of a Greywater system is to not use any spray irrigation. All Greywater must be dispersed through subsurface irrigation, either through a mulch basin or through a irrigation drip line. You can more or less use Greywater on any kind of plants, except plants that have the portion of the plant that you will then be eating in the future is in contact with the Greywater. So you can irrigate edible crops, but you just don't want to irrigate root crops. So things like carrots, potatoes, beets, even things like strawberry, which are very close to the drip line. So anything, onions, garlic, anything in that kind of root crop category. So besides that, you can more or less irrigate anything. You want to maybe stay away from watering plants that are designed to be that are adapted to be drought tolerant. A lot of drought tolerant plants like infrequent watering, whereas gray water, the way they're usually set up, you're going to get daily small doses of water. So as much I encourage drought tolerant plants, for the sections of your garden that are going to be using gray water, you should be using your gray water to irrigate more water loving plants. And I'll cover that a little more later on, but those are some of the basics of the code in California. All right, I'll get through it. So I'm gonna begin the presentation with laundry machines. One, because they don't require a permit, they're a little easier to implement and a little bit easier to understand. So some of the basic concepts are easier to grasp through a laundry machine system, and then can be applied to a bathroom system, which we'll go into later on. And one of the questions I get asked commonly, or people wonder when they're doing a system like this, is, well, how much water am I producing from my machine? And it can vary greatly. One of the challenges is that manufacturers don't typically list the amount of water that their machine uses. And another challenge is the amount of water the machine is producing per load can vary on what setting the machine is on, what kind of clothes you're washing. Certain clothes will hold the water inside the actual fabric of the clothes you're washing, so less of that will go to your landscape. Are you washing a full load versus a partial load? Yeah. And so because of that, there's a wide range. So on some of the more older traditional top loading machines, you're gonna be using anywhere from 30 to 50 gallons per load. On some of the newer front loading machines, anywhere from 10 to 20. They're getting more and more water efficient. So one of the challenges is sometimes I'll go meet a client who's looking to do a gray water system, and in some instances the machine is so water efficient they're really not producing enough water to even warrant doing a gray water system, which is not a bad problem to have. But it's good to just find out how much water you're producing, and that will help dictate how you should set up irrigation, how many outlets you're going to need. So this just gives you kind of a baseline of understanding of how much how much gray water your machine will be producing. And so once you have a rough idea of how much water is producing, here's a way to kind of find out what your weekly, monthly, yearly gray water totals will be. So one thing to keep in mind is the gray water you use now may change in the future. So if you're setting up a machine and you're going to the effort of trenching in your backyard, putting in outlets, putting in the necessary pipes and mulch basins, is you want to plan for how your usage will change in the future. I always think it's better to start off kind of small with maybe only a handful of a smaller irrigation zone with maybe watering just a handful of plants. And it's always easier to expand your system versus putting in a large system, attempting to water all the fruit trees or bushes on your property, and then having to dig it up and scale back and then have wasted money on parts and labor that isn't necessary. So I always think to start small, and you can always expand the system later. And also, typically kids, and mostly junior high, high school range, are the biggest producers of gray water. They're usually the more active, oftentimes playing sports, maybe going out more where they're changing their clothes. So they typically use the most gray water. But also keep in mind is how soon or how long will they be living there? Will that usage be changing once they move out to college? Actually, even with our current situation where more people are staying home, family members are moving back into their home because of COVID, and family structure is changing. So these are all things to consider when you're setting up your system, and trying to have. And it's not critical to know down to the gallon how much you're using, but just a rough range. So like, am I using 10 to 20 a week? Am I using 100, 150 plus? So having a rough ballpark will make things a lot easier to know how to set up your system. And so some of the basic components in a system, as you can see, I showed the three-way valve earlier. Some of the other important parts of a laundry system are your anti-siphon, which I have one of these right here. And so if you go look at your current washing machine, you have a black ABS pipe, an inch and a half, which you'll see it's called a stand pipe. It's usually a black vertical pipe standing up right behind the machine, and you'll see the laundry drain line will be kind of sitting just kind of loosely inside of it. And I know when I first saw it, I always thought that this looks like it was installed incorrectly because it's not like a tight fitting like you'd see on a PVC pipe or an irrigation pipe. It just kind of looks like it's just kind of hanging in there, and that's actually intentional because that creates a vacuum break, so the water can't siphon back into the machine. If you've ever taken a straw in your soda and put your finger on top and lift it up, and you see that the water is still inside your straw, so that is basically a simple example of a siphoning effect. And when you do a gray water system, because you're connecting a pipe that's going to go to your landscape irrigation to the pump in your machine, it is now a closed connection, a sealed connection. So you don't have that kind of loose drain pipe sitting in a standpipe scenario. So because of that, I know it's a little small in the slide, but picture number one, and I have a zoomed up. Actually, let's go to this next slide. So you can see in this picture, I'm gonna try to go to full screen again, see if it helps. That's not okay. Anyways, so if you can see in the bottom right side, the grayish colored pipe, which looks like some little paint on it. So that is the original standpipe, and you can see how the black rubber flexible pipe is just kind of sitting kind of loosely in it. So that is the bypass connection. Normally, when I'm doing a presentation, I have my little laser pointer, and I can point some things out. So I'll do my best just to describe it verbally. So actually, let's start out.
You can use your mouse there, Alan. We can see the picture.
Oh yeah, there we go. Nice, awesome. So is my mouse showing up now? Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll start out with this. So this pipe right here that I'm just running my mouse over right now, that is the original. That is the current drain line coming out of the machine. So every time you do a load of laundry and the cycle is finished, oh, I apologize, I'm in my office. So that drain line comes out of the bottom of the machine, and so every time you finish a cycle of laundry, before the gray water system was installed, this flexible black pipe would just go directly into the standpipe right here, and this gray standpipe is a connection that goes right to your sewer and into the city municipal sewer line to the water treatment plant. So when you're doing a gray water system, the basic modification you're going to be doing is installing this new three-way valve, which I was just holding up earlier. And so once you mount your three-way valve to a wall, and actually, if you notice, we've mounted it to a wall with this piece of 1 inch thick wood. This is actually a large piece of like crown molding or floor base, and it works really well for this application because it comes pre-painted, and it's got at least a nice white finish to it versus a piece of raw wood. It also has a finish to it. It's a little more waterproof than untreated or unstained wood. And the idea is, if you see these little drill holes right here, we drill that into the studs in the wall. Whereas if you were to just mount the three-way valve directly to the drywall, I don't know if you can kind of tell, but when I'm turning it, you've got to really kind of use some elbow grease to turn this handle. And I don't know why they're so difficult to turn, but every three-way valve I've ever used, it's really a challenge to turn it. And so if you have this mounted directly to the drywall and you go to turn the handle, it just rips right out of the drywall. So if you mount it to this little wood backing and then drill the holes to the studs, it has substantially more strength to it, so you don't pull the three-way valve out of the drywall. So that's just a little pro tip that I recommend. So once you've got your through valve mounted, now you have a way to connect the Greywater line, which is this purple pipe right here, and you have your basically since you've disconnected the drain pipe and you put it to the through valve, now you have another pipe that connects back into the sewer side, and on this side now you have your sewer your landscape connection. So by turning the yellow handle, you can either switch from Greywater side to sewer side. And so that's basically the function of this part. And why I was mentioning why a ball valve is bad is, if you notice this Greywater, there's never actually an off position. So it's always going to be on. It's just directing the flow in either direction. But if you were to use a ball valve, you could potentially have you could put a ball valve on each one of these pipes, but you could have them both be in the on position or an off position, and then when you go to turn on a load and your pump wants to send that water somewhere, it basically has nowhere to go, and it's just gonna basically back up into your machine. And so when I was mentioning your anti-siphon connection, so this is your anti-siphon right here. So what this does, this replicates the anti-siphon connection you have right here at the bottom. If you see how it sits loosely, as it creates an air gap. So this is just a fancy air gap up at the top, and all it is, it's just I'll try my best to get it in my camera view, but if you see there's a little piece of rubber sticking up inside there, that's just connected to a little spring, and there's like a little rubber flapper. So the air can flow one direction, but the water can't flow out of it. So what this does, this introduces air into your pipe without letting water flow out of it through the top. So that way you get the benefit of an air gap without water splashing inside of your laundry room or your garage. So this is kind of the brains of the system. This through valve and air gap are probably the two most important parts of the system, and kind of what makes the system work. And so this is basically all the interior components of your system. And then you have this purple pipe will then be directed outside going to your irrigation, your Greywater irrigation. And in my next slide, this is another type of configuration, and just kind of depends on how your house was built, how your water and drain lines are. So in this configuration, they have this is basically what they call like a valve box. And so you have your drain. This hides the standpipe. It's kind of inside the wall. These are your hot and cold connections for the laundry machine, and this is your drain pipe. So just showing you how the different variances in construction technique can vary how your system is built. And this is also a different pipe. This is, instead of using PVC, this is a polyethylene pipe. It's a product that I like to use, but it's not found off the shelf, so it's something you'll need a special order. And you'll see it looks a little wonky in this picture, but there's a couple extra fittings needed because it went from a 3/4 to 1 inch to 1.25 inches to another 1.25 inch pipe. So it's a little convoluted, but sometimes it's a little challenging because these parts aren't found off the shelf, so you got to get kind of creative. So this is a little close up. So I recommend, or actually it's part of the plumbing code as well too, is to have your system labeled. So if you see in this picture, you have just some simple arrows that show the flow of the water, and then we put with a little labeling machine. We put Greywater or garden or sewer, just so the basically, and almost every time I've done one of these systems, there's always one person in the household who's really championing the idea of doing Greywater, and they sort of kind of just drag the rest of the family along to go with their project. And because of that, not everyone is always super in tune with which is Greywater, which is a sewer mode, or where they should turn it. So just to make it easier for everyone in the household, or for household guests, or maybe you're renting a house on Airbnb, or whatever the scenario may be. If you have users who are not familiar with the system, it's good to have some labeling just to make it very clear. And if you are having someone stay at your house while you're out of town, or renting, or kids visiting, or friends visiting, and you're for any reason you're unsure of what kind of soaps you're using, or are they sending the water to the right way, just go ahead and just turn it in the sewer position until your house guests are out of town. Oops. And in that way, there's no chance of maybe someone using bleach and then they kill your, prize rhododendron or your heirloom fruit tree variety because I got a bunch of bleach from someone using it that just didn't know they couldn't use bleach. So I always tell people, if you're not sure of what's going in the water, just turn it to the sewer mode. And that's the beauty of having one of these 3 valves, is you can always return the system to its original flow. Okay, so now exiting the house, we have the sort of the irrigation portion of the system. And some little tips that I recommend, and this is true in almost any irrigation project, is when you're trenching and putting the pipes in, take a picture of the way the pipes are laid before you backfill the soil. Even if you're just putting in a typical potable water irrigation system, or you're putting in a drain line, a sewer line, whatever, it's always good to just take pictures of the pipes, because if you come back 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, it's almost impossible to remember where you put the pipes and remember how deep you put them or how many T's there are or where it 90s over. So that's just a really, really helpful thing to do, is just to take pictures. You want to make sure your pipes are at least 4 to 6 inches below grade. If it's not possible for you to dig that deep, at least make sure it's below the mulch level. The beauty of a laundry system is it's a pressurized system, so if the line isn't totally flat, there's little bumps or little bellies in the pipe or high points, the pump can navigate around that, or it can push the water through it. So it's not absolutely critical, but it is just good practice to make sure your pipes are level and flat as much as possible. It's also a good idea to test the system before you backfill it, just to make sure that your connections are sound, there's no leaks, you didn't forget to glue something or connect something. So those are just some quick and easy little tips that I recommend. Another important part too is knowing the capacity of your pump and your machine. The good thing about using an older machine is, I know sometimes when people have one, they feel kind of bad about how much energy and water they're using. The good thing is, if you are using one of those machines, they do have stronger pumps, and because they use more electricity, but they can pump quite a bit further. It's recommended not to go more than 50 feet. You can cheat a little bit and go a little bit more than 50 feet, but just understand that the more you go past 50 feet, you're opening yourself up to slightly more potential, putting a little bit more wear and tear on the life of the pump. Not always. It just depends on the configuration. Depends on how many times the pipe turns. So the more 90s you have, the more friction on the water. If it has to pump uphill, those are all things that are gonna dictate how much stress you're putting on the pump. But if you stay within 50 feet and it's a flat yard, there's not a lot of uphill grade change, you should be putting no additional pressure or wear and tear on the pump than it would be typically if it's pumping in the sewer. Because whether it's pumping it to the garden or pumping it into your sewer line, that pump is still working. So it's not any additional stress. So I know that's one thing that people worry about. They just bought a brand new machine and they don't want to, put too much stress on the pump. It's not going to be significant change as long as you kind of stay within these parameters. Okay, and so once your outlet pipe has exited the house, so this is going to change dramatically because every house is configured differently. The location of your machine is configured differently. Is the machine in the laundry room in the center of the house? Is it in the garage? Is it in the closet in the hallway, which is more common on newer houses? Is it a closet in one of the master bedrooms? Or so the way it exits the house is going to vary dramatically. If the machine is in the center of the house and you have a crawl space, typically you can go through. I should add a slide that shows how to go through your stucco. But anyways, if you're more in the center of the house, you may be going to the crawl space and then out one of the vents on the side of the house. If your machine is adjacent to an exterior wall, typically you can go right through the stucco, and then you could put a little caulking around the stucco, and then you would just 90-degree the pipe down to the ground level. And at that point, you're going to be switching over from either 3/4 or 1-inch PVC or poly pipe, and you'll be now using a if you can see where my cursor is, using a more typical flexible poly irrigation pipe. And this can also be one of the parts that can be a little bit challenging to find off the shelf, and it can be done a whole myriad of different ways. And yeah, you could actually run this in PVC as well too. Typically, people like to use a flexible poly pipe because you can have a softer 90-degree bends, which puts less stress on the machine. And so this can be done a whole bunch of different ways, but this is just one of the ways that I have done in the past that works really well for us. So you have your conversion fitting. So this allows us to go from a 3/4 PVC pipe to a 3/4 inch poly pipe. And this is just a 3/4 threaded male barbed fitting. I know no one's going to remember that, but I just wanted to point that out what it is. So this is basically a barb fit. There's no glue required for this. So it just has little ridges, almost like little teeth, and it just kind of slides over there. Sometimes people in the plumbing world, this will actually be called a nipple fitting, because it has these little barbs on it, and it just slides on with no glue. So you just cut it, slide over the barbs, and so this will all get buried, so you won't see this, but I just took this picture before it got buried just so you can see what the connections look like. And then the next point of the system is going to be where it tees off and goes to each what they call a mulch basin. And I'll go over this in more detail later on. But you have your mulch basin. So because you can't have the water pool on the ground, you dig these. I think the best way to think of it are almost like little leach fields. And so you excavate your dirt, and this is where later on you'll plant your tree or your bush or your shrub. And this is the main line running at the bottom, horizontally through the picture. And then you vertically tee off and do a 1/2 inch line. And then you'll see this little ball valve right here. And the point of this ball valve is so you can turn that ball valve right here at the end and adjust the flow of the water. So once your plant is installed in this hole, and you'll see this next picture. I don't know why my PowerPoint is not working so well. I apologize. So then you have, so another one of the ways of keeping the water from eliminating human contact is you put a mulch shield, which is just a simple valve box cover that you can find at any irrigation store. They will sell these with a purple cap. The purple cap is actually technically set up for reclaimed water, but Greywater also uses that same color designation. So if you ever see a purple pipe, know that it's either a reclaimed water connection or a Greywater connection. And what's nice about this is it allows you to pull the top off, and then you can access the ball valve down below. And that way, so if let's say you have a whole row of plants, the ball valve, the mulch basins in the beginning of the run will tend to want to get more of the water than the ones at the end of the run. So what you can do is you could partially close this ball valve to adjust the flow of the water, because you don't have a typical, like an irrigation controller or an irrigation valve to designate how long the water runs or what zone gets water. You're relying more on these mechanical fittings that can adjust the flow. So that little ball valve at the end of this 1/2 inch pipe will allow you to change how much water is flowing out of any specific outlet. And then this is with that same ball valve covered with our mulch basin cover. And then here's what that same outlet looks like after it's been covered with mulch. And what this mulch does is basically this mulch becomes like a living filter. Because if you notice that nowhere in the system was there any kind of filter, so everything that's in that water, dirt, grime, soap, lint, etc., is all going to come right out that pipe. And this mulch basically allows that water to sort of infiltrate into the soil. So soil microbes can clean the water, break down the soap, all the different debris in your line. And so basically acts as a giant kind of sponge filter. And it also allows a way for the water to percolate slowly into the soil without pooling on the surface. Whereas if you had this just maybe running to a plant just right on top of the surface, that water could potentially, if you see this little brick walkway, could pool on the brick walkway, maybe just evaporate from the sun. So having this little underground outlet underneath our valve box and the mulch around it allows for the water to be able to absorb into the soil subsurface and limit any human contact. So I'll go back up so you can kind of compare what it looked like before and then what it looks like after. And I got a couple of the pictures that show later on sort of how you would plant a tree with this too. And then here's a picture of that same outlet with the cover taken off. And so you can stick your hand in here and just access this, turn it or open it, and then put the cap on, and then you are now concealing it from human contact. So one of the things too is it's a little bit tricky to see in this picture, but there's actually a gap between the outlet right here and then the soil below it. And that gap is important. I'll see in this next slide I got here. Mainly because if you don't have that gap right here from the outlet to the base of the soil, roots are always going to travel in the direction of the source of water. So because the source of the water is the laundry machine coming out of that pipe, or from the pipe coming from the laundry machine, the roots are naturally going to follow that water source, and they're going to want to grow right up into the pipe. And it sounds crazy that probably would happen, and I've seen it countless times where the entire pipe is just one solid root, and there's one, you'll have the pipe will be destroyed. You're not utilizing the water very well. It'll block up the system. It can jam. It can make the pump have more trouble working. So really easy, simple way to avoid that happening is just maintaining this gap between the outlet of the pipe and the soil grade. And that can be done by simply opening up this cap once a year and just checking to see if there's roots growing in there. Sometimes what will happen is the mulch will kind of build up, soil will build up, and the height of it will change. So you want to just maybe pull some of that dirt out. It does tend to get a little on the gross side, but it's something you have to do pretty infrequently. And here's just another picture of a mulch basin and cover. So you want to make sure you have at least 2 inches of mulch covering it. The very end of the pipe is left open just so that there's always a way for the water to, if worst case scenario, if your pipe gets clogged or there's an issue with the ball valves, it can always flow out the end of the pipe. So you always want to leave that exposed. Some of the pros of an L2L just means laundry to landscape. So you'll see a lot of people in the greywater industry just referred to as an L2L. So some of the pros of an L2L system is they can pump slowly uphill across a large lawn or grass area. Or no, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Across a backyard, because you can't use greywater for lawns because of the overhead irrigation issue. There's very little maintenance, easy to spread the water out, easier to regulate water, not necessarily compared to a typical drip irrigation, but easier than branch drain systems, which you'll see later on. And so, like I was mentioning, some of the maintenance, maybe once or twice a year, just lifting up and checking the mulch basin outlets, making sure the machine is sending the water out properly. Oh, excuse me. Well, yawn there, I apologize. And those are really basically the only real maintenance. Maybe if you notice that one mulch basin is getting more water than the others, you could close the ball valve to limit the water it's getting and send it to the other mulch basins. You could also add another mulch basin, so you just increase the size of your zone, so that way it's spreading the water out to more plants and trees. So there's another way to make sure you're not overwatering one specific plant. So different soaps to use. The nice thing is even many people are considering using more environmentally friendly soaps, even who aren't using greywater systems. So there's a lot more manufacturers out there that are producing biocompatible soaps. So the difference between a biodegradable and a biocompatible soap is biodegradable soaps will break down in your soil, but aren't necessarily beneficial to your soil. Whereas a biocompatible soap will break down your soil, but it's usually made up of plant-based materials. So it has a little bit more of a benefit to your soil versus just sort of like breaking down and kind of spreading different manufactured chemicals in there. And they're not always necessarily bad. They're just not necessarily great. Some of the things you want to avoid are boron, phosphates, and obviously bleach. If you like to use bleach in your laundry, in your cleaning process, you can use hydrogen peroxide, which is alternative to bleach. Or on your bleach loads, you just would turn the handle to the sewer side, and all your bleach loads for if you're washing whites or baby garments, different things like that that need an extra heavy cleaning, that can just be your sewer load. Sometimes what I'll recommend to people is maybe like once a week or twice a week, depending on how many loads you do. You can have like one sewer load and just do all those clothes that are going to go to the sewer at one time, and then you can switch back over to gray water for your other loads. So that's all just basic, personal habit, and you could adapt that to your lifestyle accordingly. What plants are good for gray water? As I mentioned earlier, drought tolerant plants, even though I do recommend using them, but not necessarily in the part of the garden which is going to be receiving gray water, because drought tolerant plants like infrequent water, so they prefer having maybe water only once, twice a week, once, twice a month. Once they're established, many times drought tolerant plants don't like having any summer water. So that's an important thing to consider when you're designing your system or setting up your garden. I really recommend people to use fruit trees for irrigating with gray water. Fruit trees can typically handle large amounts of daily water. They also are going to be, they're a little more of a long-term plant. So it'd be a bit of a pain to have to constantly, if you're putting in a short-lived or more like annual plants or small herbaceous plants that don't really have a long lifespan, you're constantly always swapping out the plants, and you're having to change the irrigation quite a bit more often. So if you're doing fruit trees, large shrubs, it just requires a lot less augmentation to the system in the future, and you're getting additional benefits from fruit trees. They have more habitat value. They're also edible, create shade coverage in a garden. So just even if you're not doing a gray water system, fruit trees are just a really good choice in general. But for gray water, they're really ideal. I feel like gray water and fruit trees are a perfect marriage together. And so if the goal is to be as sustainable as possible, to cut down on water usage and kind of have a garden that is provides a little more environmental service to you, then fruit trees are a really good option. And also different berries, edible vines are really good. Kiwis are really good. Any kind of blackberries, blueberries can also work pretty well, but to be a little cognizant of, blueberries have a very specific pH requirement. So make sure that the pH of your soaps are in alignment with the pH needs of the plants that you're choosing to use. Typically, if you're using a plant-based, I really encourage people to use Oasis soap. And what's nice about them is it has a pH neutral rating, and so does Dr. Bronner's. Dr. Bronner's is basically the only commercially available soap that is pH neutral. And so if you're worried about, do you have certain plants that like basic conditions or acidic conditions or small changes in what their plant needs, getting a pH neutral soap is going to be your best bet. So Dr. Bronner's could be a really good option for a lot of people. And also Dr. Bronner's is readily available in a lot of stores, so you're not hunting around for a specific kind of soap. And so another challenge that a lot of people or homeowners have with getting their system from the inside of the house to the outside is navigating around a hardscape around the house. I have to point out that in this picture, I'm showing how we got on this concrete. If you go to drill a hole in your stucco, please use the right parts. The homeowner had drilled a hole before we'd gotten there. It looked like they might just use a sledgehammer versus using an actual hole saw. So you'd want to cut a much smaller hole than this and put some silicone around it. this was end up being repaired later on, but just a quick note to, and also you want to make something that's going to look aesthetically pleasing. So one of the challenges is when people, after they've done putting this, drilling a hole through the stucco or through the floorboards, then getting out to the backyard, is many people have either a concrete walkway around the perimeter of the house, or a brick walkway, or some other kind of hardscape surface. And one of the challenges can be is navigating around that hardscape. So you several different options. You can either trench underneath the concrete. You could run the pipe on top of the concrete, which most people don't like to do because it's a bit of an eyesore. It's not very aesthetically pleasing, and can also be a tripping hazard. Or you can get a concrete saw, and that's typically what we do, just because we have tools on hand to do it. And for us, it's quicker just to cut the concrete than to trench underneath it. Once you've cut the concrete, you can lay the pipe inside of your trench, and you can either repatch it with more concrete. In this instance, the homeowner asked us to just backfill it with some decorative rock they had on site. Oops, jumped that a couple heads, sorry. Oh, where'd my slide go? Uh-oh. No. I'm not sure what happened to that side. Here we go. Sorry about that, everybody. So in this instance, they had the homeowner had some decorative rock, and they asked us to just backfill the cut concrete with some decorative rock, and then we buried the pipe along the perimeter right here. So there's lots of different ways to get the pipe through the hardscape, and every home, every garden is going to be a little bit different. So how you achieve that is really up to you and up to your aesthetics, who is doing the work, what tools are available. If you can see in the top picture, this is the concrete saw that we use. If you don't own one or have access to one, you can rent these as well too. They can be a little bit dangerous and loud, so I would say if you are going to go that route, be aware of that, or practice cutting something else, or maybe have a handyman or a contractor help with that portion of it. Or you can trench underneath it. Trenching underneath it doesn't require any special tools besides maybe a digging bar and a shovel, and being willing to kind of get on your stomach and just kind of dig underneath the concrete, which is why we typically go with just a concrete saw. Yeah, and so once you've gotten the pipe around or under the concrete, now you can connect into your plants, your irrigation into the plants. And so here's a little kind of step-by-step process of how you would plant a fruit tree into your mulch basin. So you'd first want to dig your hole. So you're going to dig it substantially bigger than you would a regular hole for if you're just putting it straight into the ground, because you want to leave enough space for your mulch that you're going to backfill, and also for your outlet cover and your 1/2-inch outlet line. So in this instance, we've dug our hole, and then you always want to kind of just place the tree in the middle of it, just to make sure it's going to be the hole is the correct size, and the grade height is correct. And then once you've done that, you can kind of mix it with some of the existing soil on site, and mix it in with some of the soil that came in the pot. You can also mix in some other planting soil as well too. Typically, most fruit trees don't really require a lot of highly amended soil. I know a lot of people really like to put really, bags and bags of different amended soil, but most fruit trees will actually do just fine in the native soil. Actually, most of them will even do better with their native soil, because the area, the roots can adjust to all the soil around it, versus having one hole with this really, really nice soil and then a bunch of compacted clay around it. So I'm actually in favor of not amending my soils very much. So here's another picture. So if you can see, the center of it has it's a bit of a crowning effect. And now what you can backfill with mulch. I apologize, I'm in my office here and the phone's ringing. And then that way it allows you for an area of mulch around it. Okay. And you can see here, we have the little mulch basin outlet. If you don't want to purchase mulch basin outlets, you can get creative, and this is actually just a upside down 1-gallon pot, and it's kind of a fun way to use a recycled material. And any gardener is probably going to have about 50 to 100 of these probably sitting on the side of their house or in their shed somewhere, so it's something that's readily available. If you don't have one, usually a neighbor, another gardener will have plenty of 1 gallon pots they'll probably just give you. So it's an easy material to find, something you don't have to purchase. It's a great way to reuse something and not have to purchase more stuff in the store. And then here is that same plant with the mulch filled in around it. And then here's another picture of that same garden. These are kind of boring, so I'll get through these, but I'm just giving you a sense of how the process of prepping your holes are. And then once all the mulch basins are set up, you can just fill the whole area around it with mulch like this. This is a small side yard, small little fruit orchard area. And another important component, and this is actually considered part of the Greywater code, is they want to have a owner's manual. And you can actually find these online. You can just type in Greywater owner's manual, and it has a lot of things that I've already kind of covered in this presentation are kind of broken down, very simplified in a little owner's manual like this. You might want to include in your owner's manual pictures of the irrigation configuration. So like before you've backfilled your pipes, you can take a picture of all the outlets and where all the pipes are laid, and then you can include it in a little pamphlet like this. And I typically recommend people put it, this is a little plastic sleeve. You can also laminate it and then put this back behind your washing machine somewhere. And why it's nice to have it laminated, just in case it gets any water or gets dirty, you know, and in a couple of years it's not totally destroyed. You can find it and get that information very easily. So here's some basic idea of the system costs. If done by a professional, a Greywater system like this can cost anywhere between $1,500 to $2,500. The major price variation is going to depend on how much work they need to do around the hardscape. Are they cutting it? Are they trenching around it? How much stucco work is required? Is it just a wood siding house, which is fairly easy, versus a stucco, which isn't that much more difficult, but usually a stucco house will require maybe a small amount of patching afterwards, maybe a little bit of silicone, a little bit of paint. Wood siding houses can be a little easier, a little smoother and cleaner cut. Or you're going through the floorboards, which are even easier, and you can hide the penetration point. So those are all things that can change the price. Homeowner installation can be anywhere from $300 to $500, just depending on what parts you decide to purchase. You know, what kind of pipe you're using, how many feet of pipe you purchase. So that's just kind of a rough range that I just give people a sense of what these systems cost. All right, and so on to the next style. So we talked about one of the beauty of using a laundry system is you have the benefit of the pump inside the machine. So you're going to be using that like the same amount of electricity, whether it's pumping into your garden or it's pumping into the sewer. And so it's basically like a net. There's no increase in your overall usage of electricity, and you have the benefit of a pumping action. Versus a bathroom system, those are all going to be gravity feed systems unless you purchase a manufactured kit, which then has a pump and filter in it, which we'll see later on. So your typical bathroom system will be what's called a branch drain system. And you're basically using ABS pipe to gravity feed the water into the garden, like so. And you're still going to be using the little mulch basin covers and outlets like we looked at in the previous pictures. These will have, because it's all gravity fed, when you want the system to branch off to different plants and trees in a garden, you use what is called a flow splitter. So flow splitter is don't use that term when you go to a plumbing supply house, because they will have no idea what you're talking about. If you go to a supply house, this is either called a double L, a double 90, or a double quarter bend. Those are all plumbing terms used for this. And so a flow splitter is a Greywater term, so just heads up on it. But the idea is it is splitting the flow of the water coming from the bathroom. And a modification that is made for Greywater use is to cut a hole right in the center, right where the water is going to split. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to put this cap in there. So when you're doing this, if you're putting this flow splitter, well, how do you know where the water is going? So if you're looking at it just like this, it's very difficult to know, is the water going only to one side? Is it going to the other side? Is it halfway? Is it 75-25? You know, it's very hard to tell if you can't see the water. So by having this flow splitter, it allows you to open this up and you can see the flow of the water, because you want to make sure this is dead level in the soil. So we have exactly 50-50% split. And then you'll also put this inside of a valve box like so, as you can see in the slide. So what this valve box does, it allows you to access this buried fitting, whereas if you didn't have that valve box, you wouldn't be able to find the fitting and to be buried in the ground, making it a little more challenging to access. And then once you've opened the valve box, you can take this little cap off right here. And not only can you check the flow of the water, sorry, I'm trying this backwards, but if there's ever a clog or a leak, you can take this off and you could snake it out and you could clear the clog in the line. So it has multiple functions. So this little device is called a flow splitter, and it's kind of one of the key components of a branch drain system. And here is a shot of a branch drain system being installed. And to make a system like this work correctly, you need to make sure that all of the pipes are sloped at just 2%, and you have your flow splitters I was just showing you are level. So that way the water will flow slightly downgrade at this point. It will hit the level flow splitter and then split evenly to each branch of your zone, of your irrigation system. That's where you get the name branch drain system. And the beauty of this is it's very, very simple, but the challenge is there is a lot more trenching involved, and there's a lot more just kind of like finessing of the pipe. So it's not, by not having the benefit of a pump, which can kind of, you know, pump the water in any direction. If it's not perfectly flat, if it's going uphill, a lot of those things aren't as important. Whereas in a branch drain system, slope and gravity are key to making the system work. And so in a lot of gardens, if your garden is sloped uphill, if you have a lot of hardscape, a lot of trees with extensive root systems, sometimes this system is not going to always be possible. So the application of branch drains is a little more limited than a laundry system or other systems that I'll show you here shortly. And similar to the small brass through valve we saw that goes behind your machine, you're going to use a 3-inch through valve for this kind of system. And typically you can find these in pool supply stores. They're used when you're setting up a solar hot water or other heating element to your hot tub or pool. And so you can take that same product and apply it to a branch drain system or a gray water system. The challenge with this is, since you're modifying the plumbing underneath the house, so when you're doing a bathroom system versus a laundry system, you're going to be doing a lot of your work like this in the crawl space. And unlike a laundry system where your 3-valve is right behind the washing machine, your 3-way valve for your branch drain system is going to be located down here in this crawl space. And you will probably never see a crawl space look like this, because most crawl spaces, there's going to be no light. There's going to be spider webs everywhere. There's probably going to be a cat, maybe a mouse, probably a dead one, and hopefully not a raccoon. So don't let this picture fool you. That is never going to look this pleasant and easy. It's usually only going to be about 8 inches of space. So I got to give you that. I use this picture because you can see what's happening, but this is not what it's going to look like when you're doing the work, I can promise you. So the 3-valve is typically going to be positioned after the sinks and showers, but before it connects in with the toilet. So this is actually where I highly recommend having a licensed plumber do this part of the work. And if you're going to hire a licensed plumber, you should really have a licensed plumber who has specific knowledge of gray water systems. I would say 75 to 80% of the bathroom systems that I have done in the last 10 years is basically going out to fix other plumbers' mistakes when doing these kind of systems. And it's not that they're a bad plumber or they're negligent or not paying attention. It's just gray water systems are basically complete opposites to what most plumbers have been taught in their trade school. Most plumbers are trained to catch all the water, connect it to the sewer, and get it off the property as soon as possible. And with gray water systems, we are now connecting the water, catching and holding it, and then sending it out to an irrigation system. So it takes a bit of retraining and rethinking. So most plumbers, it's just hard for them to kind of gravitate towards doing that because it just goes against everything they've been taught. So if you're going to hire a plumber, make sure they either have direct experience with gray water systems, they're willing to work with a gray water designer installer, or do a little bit of research themselves. But many times plumbers just kind of want to wing it and sort of just do it sort of the way they've been taught. And of all the systems I've seen done by plumbers like that, I would say 100% of them have been done incorrectly. And like I said, it's not anything bad on them. It's just because this is a little bit different than what they've typically been caught. So just a little word of advice from my previous experience. And so why I was mentioning this is your three-way valve will be located down here under the house. And when you want to turn it, no one's going to go crawl under their house to turn that valve. So what typically is done is there's a actuator where my cursor is right now. This little blue box has a small motor in it. This little motor is connected to a transformer and a switch, which is mounted inside of either the bathroom or in the utility room. And this allows you just to flip this switch and it will turn the motor, and that will allow you to change from sewer or to gray water. And so that is an important component of the system too, because you always need to be able to connect to the sewer. So that way you can avoid having to go under the house, but still turn that valve when needed. And then here's a little close-up of that same double L I was just showing you. So this is just another example of it in the garden. And this is an example of a system during installation. And so you can see where the little flow splitters are right here. So the water comes from the house down this pipe, hits this flow splitter, flows into this one zone, and then you have another series of outlets along this branch of the system. And so as you can see, it's very simple, not a lot of parts, but a lot of trenching. The further away from the house, because it's sloped downwards to work with gravity, the further away, the deeper and deeper your trench is going to be. So although the system is very simple, a bit more hand labor intensive than most. So here's another close-up of that system. And then here was that system after it was buried. So the pipes went to these fruit trees, and it's kind of hard to tell here, but there's some small perennial plants planted along here. And when it's all done, you don't really see any of that pipe. It's all covered. It's all subsurface. So the beauty of a gray water system is, it's not going to look any different than a regular irrigation system. It can flow with the look of the garden just like any other system would. And here it is also watering some blueberries and some other plants. I think we have some blueberries, some different herbs, I think some artichoke, and a couple of different kind of water-loving native plants here in this garden. So some of the pros and cons, obviously I mentioned simplicity, no moving parts, very inexpensive, no electricity. And I should give a note. So inexpensive in the actual labor. There is going to be some cost in getting the permit and drafting up a design. When you go to get your permit, you're going to be pulling a plumbing permit. They're going to want to see a drawing. So and it's every city is going to be a little bit different in terms of what level of sophistication they're going to want to see outlined in the drawing. Are you showing every single connection? Are you showing the irrigation parts, the soap you're using? So that's all going to be, it's going to change from city to city. So there is some cost in doing some of that planning and prep work and drafting that up. But overall, the actual part itself is pretty inexpensive. The cons, if you have a slab foundation, this kind of system just isn't possible because your pipes are underneath the concrete slab. The labor, not only is it kind of labor intensive, you're also working underneath the house, which just sucks. And it's just not fun working in a crawl space. there is, ABS, a lot of ABS pipe, a lot of ABS glue. So there's a lot of material, involved in it, which I always try and avoid using much plastic and as many store-bought materials as possible, but it's sort of unavoidable. So that can be, and depending on your view on things, that could be a downside. Okay, so the next one that I'll get into, I want to get to your questions here pretty soon too. So, and these pump systems can vary dramatically, from sort of do-it-yourself type systems to manufactured systems. The cost can range from literally $500 to $50,000, depending on how sophisticated it is, how much automation there is, are using computer programming. It completely runs the gamut. So one of the original kind of gray water manufactured systems that came into market back in the 80s was a system made by Rewater. Basically, they use almost like a modified spa or pool filter to clean the water and then pump into the garden. So you have a small surge tank that goes into basically a pool filter, and then sends the water to a series of valves. So this is just one system here. This is that system after it's been. I'm not going to go into all the details of how they work. I'm just going to kind of basically give you some real quick overview that they're out there and kind of basics of how they work. But if you want to learn more, it'd be much easier to go and look at the websites of different various manufacturers. So this is what that system looks like during installation. You can see the flow. One of the benefits of these kind of systems is if there's not enough gray water being produced in the system, you can have a backup freshwater connection. Oops, sorry. So in this picture here, the orange lines show you where you can add a potable water connection. So if you're not using enough gray water, you can add that line in to supplement your irrigation usage, your irrigation demand. Here is just the valve. And if you notice that these systems are significantly more involved than a simple branch drain system, but cost is going to be considerably more. And this should absolutely be done by a certified gray water installer or a plumber with significant experience in gray water systems. I would not tackle one of these if I were a homeowner. So here's a automated three valve as well. I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly. So this has a 70-gallon surge tank, so you can capture 70 gallons of gray water per day. You can't store the gray water for longer than 24 hours. That's a really, really important caveat. A lot of times people ask, oh, can I get a bigger tank and store the water for longer? That way I can hold more water. But there's no advantage to holding more water or holding the water for a longer period of time, because the demand of your landscape water usage is going to always be more than the gray water that you're producing. So holding the water, there's just no benefit to it. And actually, the longer you hold that water will go from gray water to black water within a few hours. That water will go anaerobic and become absolutely disgusting. So I cannot stress that enough, that please don't store gray water. Here's a cover for it with the pipe inlet and outlet fittings partially covered. There's a little access point with the wood on top. Here's some more during installation. And this is that system after it's been covered, and you can see the irrigation pipe running through here. Let me get these a little quicker. I'm not promoting one system over another. I'm just letting you know what's out there. Let me go through these a little quicker. These are more irrigation outlets for the Rewater system. This is another system by GrayFlow. Actually, I don't really recommend these systems, this particular brand. They've had a lot of problems and issues, but I just give you an idea of what's out there. Here you can see this is our gray water coming from the house into a three-way valve. Here's your sewer overflow connection with your pump basin and filter here. That's your irrigation outlet. This just shows you a labeling of where the parts, where they go, and what their function is. Once again, this is, I actually really almost don't recommend using these. I shouldn't even show it. I apologize. But it's just good to know what the different options are on the market. Come on. This is that same system after it's been covered. Actually, that system we were installed this about 7 or 8 years ago, and it failed, and we've now upgraded to a system kind of similar to this guy right here. This is made by a company called Flow Tender. So again, this is just your. It's really important to note this is actually a surge tank, not a storage tank. So it's just big enough to catch the water for that initial shower or sink usage to trigger a float switch to then send the water out to the filter in the garden. So it's only catching, a few hours worth of water before it gets used. And so there's that same system after it's been covered. Another system, this is actually one that I like using a little more, is made by a company called Irrigation. But this system and Flow Tender are about on the same par as that system. This is during construction, so some of the pipes are still exposed. You can kind of just see how they're all working together. This is the pump. There's a few different flow sensors. You have a water meter here. So these are quite a bit more involved than the branch drain systems. And one of the reasons why we end up going with a system like this versus like the branch drain systems that we saw was just a gravity fed pipe is many times when we're doing our systems, we're being hired to design and install a full landscape. And most people love the idea of Greywater, but they want it to function just like a regular irrigation system is going to work. So they want to be able to water some of their roses. They want to be able to water lawn. They want to be able to water their fruit trees and edible garden and all these small different zones. And with a branch drain system, you really can't have that level of adaptability. Branch drain system, you're only going to be able to water a small handful of plants. But with one of these pumped and filtered systems, you could irrigate a whole garden, hundreds of plants, uphill, downhill, across the whole yard with a full filtration system. It'll have a drip system. It'll function just like a regular irrigation system will, but with the advantage of using a Greywater system. So that's sort of the reason why we would ever go. And there are more simplified versions of these systems that you can kind of build yourself. I'm not going to get too into that, but these are ones that you can buy off the shelf that are commercially available that you can buy that can be installed by anyone with proper training versus a DIY one that you got to sort of fabricate yourself. There is a company down in Southern California called Greywater Core, and they have a really cool system that they've developed. It's sort of a DIY type system that they have put together themselves. I should add it to my slideshow, but they make a really cool system it's sort of in the middle of a branch drain system and one of these pump systems. And it's the owner of that company is called Lee Jarrett. He's a really good installer, very knowledgeable, and he's come up with some cool solutions too. So I checked them out as well. And if I have not bored you to death, I thank you for listening through all this. We'll get to some of your questions. My last slide is just a little link here with these are some different suppliers, installers, other places we can find resources. There's a water. You can get a rebate for doing a laundry system. A couple places where you can find some of the blue lock and some of the different things I mentioned here. So just a good way to get your foot in the door and get started on a Greywater system. And I want to thank everyone who actually sat through the whole presentation. Hope it was not filled with too much jargon. And we can get to some of the questions.
Thanks, Alan. We've got a couple questions going here in the chat.
Yeah, please.
It's sort of going to be a review of what you might have already said, but I'll read the questions to you and you can just sort of address them. So if you buy a different washing machine in the future, can you damage it with the Greywater system that you're currently enabling?
No, it's basically let's say you have a machine currently and it either fails or you just decided to get one more efficient. It's just a matter of swapping out the drain line in the back of the machine and plugging it into the through valve. So literally a few minutes. It wouldn't take you any longer to connect it to the Greywater system than it would just plugging it in and connect to a standpipe. So no, it's no real issue.
Okay, great. And I know you covered this as well, but is it safe to use Greywater to water lemon trees, avocados, grass, and you definitely do need a biodegradable soap, I'm assuming?
Yeah, it's no problem irrigating to any of those trees. Just the one thing to keep in mind is you should always know the pH of your soap whenever possible. And 80-90% of the applications, it's the pH of the soap is not going to change the pH of your soil. The amount of water you would need to change the pH of your soil is way more than the amount of gray water you're producing anyways. But if it's your prized tree or a very sensitive plant that you really want to make sure you don't harm it, then you go to the effort of either using pH neutral soaps or go buy some pH strips. I think you can buy them at even like a Long's Jugs or Walgreens. You can buy some little real simple pH strips and you could do a little pH test. But for the most part, it's not a huge issue unless it's something, a plant that if it died, would break your heart. Then, really maybe go to the extra effort, but I wouldn't stress on it too much. And to follow up on the issue of lawn, I really try to get people to steer clear of using gray water on lawns. One, for laundry machines, you can't use laundry machine water for lawns just because there's no filter. And so there's no way to filter the water to a point where you could use it for subsurface lawn irrigation. And you can't use it for overhead spray on a lawn. So it's just, it is possible, but it just, for a lot of reasons, just doesn't make sense. You can do it with one of the manufacturer systems that I talked about at the end. If you have one of those kind of systems, then it's a little more feasible. One reason why I try to get people to not necessarily use lawns is if the whole goal with doing gray water or rainwater or drought tolerant gardens is to cut down on overall water usage, I think the easiest way to start out with that is just getting rid of your lawn. I think it's a shame to go all this effort to put in a gray water system and cut down on water usage and try and be more sustainable with how you handle your water just to irrigate a very water consuming plant like grass. I'm not saying you can't do it or you're a bad person if you do, but if you really insist on doing grass, there are options to do it. It's just going to be a little more costly, take a little more planning, definitely have someone who's trained and certified in gray water installation do that installation. And you really got to have a better understanding of which water the lawn's going to use versus the amount of gray water you're producing. Most lawns will consume more water than the amount of gray water you're producing anyways. So you'll need to have a potable water connection in conjunction with the gray water. So there's just a lot more things to think about when you're doing lawns. One thing I do recommend people, let's say if you do have a lawn in your backyard or your front yard that you want to irrigate, use potable water for the lawn area and then just use gray water for other portions of the property and landscape. It's just a much easier way to do it. And your gray water should be considered like one of the zones. So the gray water is just one zone for non-potable water, and then things like your lawn can be your potable zone. It's a much better way to do it.
Yep, great. Yeah, and thanks for the pro tip on.
Sorry if that's long-winded. I apologize.
No, it's all good. So the next question is, does the same apply to septic systems regarding needing to redirect to the septic tank?
Yeah. So when you have your three-way valve, when you're not sending the water to your landscape, sending it to septic is equivalent to sending. So whenever I say sewer, you can interchange that with the septic system. It'll function the same way.
Okay.
And actually, the nice thing about putting in a gray water system is if you're sending a lot more of your water to your landscape, you will be reducing you'll be reducing the load of your septic system. So if you are traditionally consuming more or creating more gray water than your septic system was designed to accept, and you're having septic issues, an easy way to solve some of your septic issues is just sending less water to your septic system. And great way to do that is by having a gray water system, because now the septic is just having to process a lot less water.
Yeah, Good point. Yeah. So this is for folks who are not in California. Do you need to worry about the pipes freezing in the winter?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So any if you're in our portions of California, we will get freeze if you're up in the Sierras, or Sierra foothills. Any exposed pipe should be insulated. And any pipe, I believe, I don't work in a lot of zones areas that freeze. I believe if you're in an area where the ground freezes, your pipe should be, I think, a minimum of 18 inches deep, 12 to 18 inches deep. So keep that in mind. But I would say whatever, if you're in a part of the state or country that freezes, whatever you're doing currently to make sure your potable water, your mainline water, and your irrigation pipes from not freezing, just apply that same knowledge to a gray water system.
Okay. So this is going back to the gray water being used for overhead watering on lawns. So someone's asking, why can't you use the gray water for overhead irrigation for lawns?
Because it's disgusting. Just think whatever water comes out of your shower or your sink or your laundry. Yes, it's okay for your plants and whatnot, but is that water that you want to have that your dog can run through when the sprinkler's going, or your kids can run through it, or it's like pooling on the ground or in the air? It's not the worst thing in the world, but if you can avoid it, it's just good practice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just more of just a public health issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a really easy way to limit exposure and limit a public health issue is just not have it be sprayed in the air, and so just use it subsurface.
Mm-hmm.
And even gray water side, if you're just running, you're just irrigating your landscape, the more subsurface you can use and not use overhead spray. Drip irrigation is substantially more efficient than overhead spray irrigation, even for potable water use. So even when we're putting in a traditional irrigation system and not a gray system, I try to always avoid overhead spray.
Yeah.
It's quite wasteful.
Okay, great. And one last question here is, could you explain to the audience what can be part of the gray water system and what cannot be part of the gray water system?
In reference to like plants?
Oh, no, in reference to what can you connect to the gray water system, your shower, your sink, your laundry, clearly not the toilet.
Yeah.
So what you can and cannot.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So basically laundry machines, bathroom sinks, bathroom showers, bathtubs, AC units. You can put the water from AC units. I've seen people put their reverse osmosis water into like a sort of a gray water type system. But yeah, so everything besides toilets and kitchen sinks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Actually, a huge question just came in. Yes. You may or may not be able to answer this, but I'm just going to read it out for you. So this one is from Sharon, and she asks, how would you categorize fish hatchery water? A previous HOA board voted to connect to the pond water to save money on potable water. We have invested in a $210,000 irrigation upgrade, and now all the equipment is plugging up with green slime and ceasing to function.
Oh yeah.
Are there any options to save a multi-million-dollar landscape?
Oh yeah. So I'm kind of amazed that someone had the forethought to put in a system like that. It was actually kind of a good idea to do that, but didn't have the wherewithal to put in a pre-filter. Probably like a $100 pre-filter, or put a UV filter, which will break down some of the biological filter. But that's probably a little more advanced question than I could answer here. But if whoever's asking that question, if they want to email me directly, and I could send them over some different filters that would work. They're basically just having like a buildup of algae in their pipes now. It's a really good idea though to reuse some of that pond water, but just needs to be handled correctly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Alan. I think you pretty much answered all the questions there, and this was a fabulous presentation. And I know I've heard it several times, and I learned something new every time. So,
cool, sweet. I'm glad.
And again, this will be emailed to all the participants, and just want to say a huge thank you again to Alan and for everybody for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.
Too.